QuickTake. I'm Madison Mills. Hurricane Laura is expected to become a Category 4 hurricane and make landfall off the coasts of Louisiana and Texas overnight. This comes, of course, as southern states are reeling from COVID-19. Joining us to talk about the official response to these events is Houston's Mayor Sylvester Turner. Mr. Mayor, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon to talk about how Houston is planning to respond. First, I just want to get kind of a brief overview on how you're doing. How are you holding up?
Well, I'm doing fine. This city has been battle tested so many times over the last several years, reference to storms, and we just each storm is different, but Houstonians know what to do, and based on what we are getting as of early this morning, it seemed like the storm moves slightly to the right, which will help us out quite a bit.
And I want to talk about the storm for the start of our conversation here. What plans do you have if the storm kind of elevates and gets, unfortunately, worse for the residents of Houston?
Well, I will tell you that we had already entered voluntary evacuations for some of our zip codes that are further south, closer to the coast. And so we issued voluntary evacuations for them on yesterday. At the same time, we've set up a number of shelters throughout the city because of COVID-19. We can't do things like we did things, for example, during Hurricane Harvey when we had 10,000 people in our convention center. So there are a number of shelters so that we can engage in the social distancing and the COVID protocols, taking the temps and things of that nature. We have encouraged people, for example, to do everything they need to do to put together their hurricane kits. But in addition to the batteries and making sure you have your medicine, make sure that they're adding, for example, the portable chargers, in addition to masks, sanitizers, all of those things. So an expanded hurricane kit. And then going back to Hurricane Ike in 2008, that was more of a wind event where it was wide power outages, where people were without power for about 14 days. And so we've asked people to be mindful of that. And in talking with CenterPoint Utility, for example, they have an additional right at 7,000 people on the call, ready to come into, for example, into the city, into this area the day after, for example, the storm passes. They're already about 2,000, but they've called up about an additional 7,000 people, linemen, people to cut trees and things of that nature.
And you mentioned Hurricane Ike. I want to ask you about the Ikedyke. What is the plan for building and kind of following through on some of the safety measures that are needed to keep residents safe?
In fact, we talked about that again at the city council meeting today. There are two storms, hurricanes, that entered the Gulf in this past week. And of course, Hurricane Laura again emphasizes the importance of what we call either the Ikedyke or the coastal spine. If, for example, if this storm were to hit right along the Galveston Bay, the storm surge would create just a horrific amount of destruction, of damage, and to businesses, to the Port of Houston, to residents, homeowners, and so it points out again how important it is for us to put in place an Ikedyke or the coastal spine, and we're certainly encouraging the federal government along with the state to really step up to fund that necessary project.
And some officials are calling areas that are due to get hit by this storm unsurvivable. What's your advice to residents who are hearing that and are understandably really concerned?
Well, the reality is that more people lose their lives from the storm surge. When you've got, for example, a Category 3, Category 4, higher storm coming into the area, more people die from the storm surge. So you have to evacuate. That if you're right along that coastline, you simply don't have a choice. Just like in this particular case, there was a great deal of unpredictability as to where this storm was going to land. And so people in Southeast Texas, Beaumont, Port Arthur, Chambers County, they evacuated. Those were mandatory evacuations. Galveston, for example, they entered a mandatory evacuation because it's not necessarily the rain or the wind, it's that storm surge that creates a great deal of damage. So when you're dealing with a storm of this magnitude, you You just don't want to wait it out and hope for the best. You really have to get out of its way.
And you mentioned evacuations. A new study is showing that evacuation measures that have typically been used in these scenarios could increase virus numbers by tens of thousands. So I'm wondering, how will your response, if residents do unfortunately have to evacuate, how will your response include a desire to reduce the risk of spreading COVID-19?
Right. And good question. I mean, the reality is that the coronavirus is fuel when you come together. Bringing people together will fuel this virus. So when you're preparing for a hurricane or a major storm event like Hurricane Laura, you have to bear that in mind. Instead of clustering a lot of people together into, let's say, 2 or 3 big shelters, you need to have a number of them so you can still engage in social distancing. In the case, for example, in the preparation for this storm, we were not just going to be using the convention center or schools. We were also going to be using, thousands of hotel rooms and putting people in hotel rooms to spread them out. At the same time, we encourage people to be tested ahead of time because it's important for people to know their status. Just in case if they had to go bunk with family members or friends or neighbors, they needed to know their status. So the testing was pushed very strongly ahead of this storm. So there are several other protocols that we put in place, pre-screening, and then in bringing people into, for example, your shelters to the extent they were going there, we needed to make sure that we kind of tested them first, did the temperature checks, make sure they had on their masks, make sure they had protocols, social distance themselves, even in evacuating, for example, putting people on buses where you could have put, let's say, 55 people on a bus and moved them out. You reduce that number in half so that you can socially distance them, which means it requires more vehicles. It just takes longer. So there are many other factors that we are doing now that we didn't do, for example, during Hurricane Harvey or previous storms. Otherwise, you can save people from, quote unquote, the storm, but you put them at even greater risk as it relates to the virus. Either way, if you get it and people have underlying health conditions, you get sick in the hospital, you end up dying. It really doesn't make a difference whether it's the storm or it was the virus.
And you mentioned the importance of testing, and I know that you've closed testing because of the hurricane. Are you concerned that a lack of testing sites could potentially increase the virus in the area?
Oh, absolutely. Testing is critical. For the virus, the testing is your radar. It helps you to identify where the virus is. So we're having to deal with the virus as well as with the storm at the same time. In the absence of testing, and I would say ubiquitous widespread testing, it makes it very difficult to determine the prevalence of the virus in your community. I was just on the phone with my health director, essentially saying, look, we suspended testing for Wednesday and Thursday because we didn't quite know where the storm was going to be coming. To the extent the storm bypasses a stage to the east, we want to get testing up as quickly as possible, and we're looking to see if we can get testing up on Thursday so we can get right back at it.
And I also want to talk about your message to residents who are concerned about whether or not they should be evacuating. What is your message to them?
Well, if you're along that coastal area, quite frankly, if your local officials uh, and tells you and encourage, well, number one, if we issue a mandatory evacuation, you really need to evacuate. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, if we issue a voluntary evacuation, you really need to consider that very strongly. If you're along the coast, okay, and run the risk of being in the area where there could be the storm surge, then you seriously need to consider evacuating if your local officials tell you to do just that. Every storm is different. And what we have said to people as it relates to Hurricane Laura is different from Hurricane Harvey. Harvey was primarily a rain event. Hurricane Laura is a hurricane And for us, it's more of a wind and storm surge event. So every storm is different and has its own different personalities. And so in this case, with Hurricane Laura, if you're closer to the coastal area, within that range of probability of being impacted by a storm surge, if there's a mandatory evacuation, you need to leave. If there's a voluntary evacuation, you need to take it very seriously. And to the extent you can leave, you ought to do just that.
And talking about how the city more broadly is doing, the city's finances were already impacted by COVID-19.
Yes.
Were threatened by a fall off in tax revenue stemming from the virus. How much more of a hit will Houston incur financially from things like this hurricane?
Well, look, it complicates things even more. It certainly puts more of a financial burden because we still need to meet the needs of the people within our city. And quite frankly, those who are visiting our city, anyone that's within our city, we're responsible for. The coronavirus, the impact that it's had, for example, on our sales tax, parking fees, in a number of different areas, the city will be impacted for the next 2 to 3 years. Okay. The initial relief package we received from the federal government really only deals with primarily with testing, and with taking steps to mitigate the risk of the coronavirus. It was not intended, for example, to replace the hole caused by the reduction of revenue as it relates directly from the coronavirus. And Congress has yet to come in to assist cities in filling that hole, and we need them to do that. The reality is, for example, whether it's the coronavirus or whether it's the storm, you still need police, you still need fire, you still need your municipal workers, solid waste, picking up debris, um, uh, your water systems, public works, whether it's the virus or the storm, those essential services cannot stop. Okay, and cities are still responsible for fulfilling those obligations. And when you combine the coronavirus with the storm, then those responsibilities are heightened. Okay, this is not the time to pull back. Cities can't pull back. I need my employees out on the front line, testing and other things with the virus. I need them out on the front line when we're trying to make sure that we evacuate and get people out of harm's way. They're needed on all fronts. So I'm especially appreciative and grateful. So in terms of the financial hardship that this city is having to experience, it is enormous. And you do the best you can under the circumstances. And we continue every day to find a way to make sure that we are meeting the needs of the people who need us the very, very best. My hope is that Congress will not turn a blind eye, because quite frankly, cities are on the front line. And you can't tell a storm, don't come your way. Okay. And you can't tell a virus because look, we have so many other needs, stop and go away. Neither one of them will stop just because the city's financial situation is in dire shape.
Mr. Mayor, I know you have a very busy day to get to, but just following up on that quickly, are there any specific plans in place? I know you got out of a city council meeting this morning. Any plans that you all have talked about on your end about how you'll support residents financially if their jobs or workplaces are impacted by not only this hurricane, but we're at the start of a hurricane season here, right? So what if things continue?
I will tell you, for people, for example, who have lost their jobs, have been furloughed, of their income and revenue streams have been reduced because of the coronavirus. Right now, as we speak, the city has put forth this rental assistance program to provide rental assistance for many of those individuals. We have partnered with many of our landlords, apartment complexes, for example, and worked out an arrangement that's saying, look, we're putting $20 million into a rental assistance program for any apartment complex that agrees to accept rental assistance, even for one tenant. They are agreeing not to evict any of their tenants in their complex. So, for example, if you have 200 units And if a tenant in one of those units receive our rental assistance for 2 months, 1 month, whatever they may be behind, the landlord is agreeing not to evict any of those 200 tenants in that apartment unit. So I want to thank them for joining in with us. The second program that's going on right now is our small business economic relief assistance for small businesses. If you've been in business, for example, for at least 1 year, and if your revenue is $2 million or less for a year, then you are subject to receiving a grant up to $50,000 from our Small Business Economic Relief Program. Those are two programs that are currently in play right now to assist our renters as well as to assist our small businesses. The third program deals specifically with artists. So if you're an artist and you too have been economically disadvantaged because of the coronavirus, then we have a small program to assist artists as well in making it through this particular time.
Mr. Mayor, I know you have to go, but one final question for you. I want to ask you about Jacob Blake. What is your message to folks who are reeling from yet another police shooting in this country?
You know, it's painful. We're all wrestling with it. You know, law enforcement and the community should be on the same page, working together, moving in the same direction. You know, the police shootings, especially when the obligation is to protect and serve, is certainly being tested at this point in time. And every one of these shootings have to be carefully examined. We're certainly, even in the city of Houston, we're looking at ways on how we can reform, for example, our police system, looking at our internal policies, practices, and procedures, emphasizing the importance of de-escalation, emphasizing before using deadly force where you can to provide a verbal warning, making sure that officers are required to report or to intervene if another officer or officers are doing something wrong. They have that obligation, making sure that every instance of deadly force is reported, establishing that database, that data system, eliminating no-knock raids, or warrants, for example. Those are things that we have already implemented. And I have a task force right now that's looking at various ways on how to reform in a meaningful way law enforcement, our police operation in our city. But police, they're out there on the front line. They have a hard job. In many cases, we ask them to do way too much, but the situation is painful. My heart goes out, for example, to Jacob Blake and to his family. I wish him well. I'm praying for him. I know he's still is going through surgeries and experiencing a lot of pain and the possibility of being paralyzed. So look, it's tough and it's challenging, but we have to find ways to get it right, because the public is certainly demanding us to get it right, and we have to get it right, and we need to get it right for our police officers who are out there on the front line and for the people that we have an obligation to protect and to serve. So we've got to continue to work through it, and I believe if we do it and we do it in good faith, I think we can end up with some reforms that will serve us well for now and for years to come.
Mayor Turner, thank you so much. You were so generous with your time this afternoon. Thank you for chatting with us. For those of you watching, please follow Bloomberg QuickTake wherever you get your news, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.